1794, Western farmers will engage in a rebellion against Alexander Hamilton's whiskey tax. We see here a tax collector being tarred and feathered. Now, the reason they did this is because the whiskey tax hurt the farmers, particularly not because they were drunk or anything, although many of them I'm sure were. But the problem with whiskey was it's what farmers did with their excess grain. When you raised your grain and you sold it, whatever you couldn't sell, you then fermented it into whiskey so it didn't go bad, because whiskey would be good for several years. And so when Hamilton puts a tax on whiskey, it's really a tax that specifically hits and hurts Western farmers. When the farmers in the West rose up in their whiskey rebellion, George Washington will actually ride out at the head of an army, 15,000 troops strong, to put this rebellion down. It's the only time in American history where an American president has ridden at the head of an army. Hamilton actually commands the army, and as soon as the army shows up, the rebels flee. There's no real battles here or anything. The Westerners are made happy by the addition of new states, which gives them increasing political power. The 14th state to join the Union is Vermont in 1791. Kentucky comes along in 1792. And Tennessee is added in 1796. And then Ohio in 1803. So as the Westerners get states, they get political power, they get seats in the House and seats in Congress, and they are happier. One of the constants of the early part of America is war with Native Americans. We tried to honor the Articles of Confederation treaties with the Native Americans, and it was unclear what the Native American status was. Were they American citizens? Were they foreign nationals because they were members of tribes? Everyone seemed to agree that they had some sovereignty over their own land, but we gave them no official recognition as having any rights under the American government. Probably the biggest issue of the day in politics was the French Revolution. Now, of course, this didn't have a whole lot to do with America directly, but it had to do a lot with America ideologically. The French Revolution was inspired by the American Revolution. It was the people rising up and throwing off their king. They, of course, cut the head off their king in the French Revolution, and getting rid of any sort of ruling aristocracy. And the French Revolution gets out of hand. They begin to execute anyone they see as being overly aristocratic. And even in a terrible turn of irony, Marquis de Lafayette, the great Frenchman who had helped the Americans so much and was sort of an adopted son of George Washington, will be imprisoned by the French for being an aristocrat. Ironic, since it was his help that helped us win the American Revolution, and the American Revolution which inspired the French Revolution. It's also worth pointing out that Thomas Paine, the guy who wrote Common Sense and was a key factor in sparking our revolution, left America after the American Revolution, moved to France, and wrote pamphlets there and sparked their revolution as well. So Thomas Paine, a crucial figure in both of these revolutions. The French Revolution made France a pariah, or hated by everybody in Europe. They had cut the head off their king, and most of the rest, or all the rest of the European nations had kings. And so the rest of Europe turns against France. In 1793, France and England will engage in a war called the Anglo-French War. And generally there's an anti-democratic sentiment across Europe. America tries to remain neutral to this. In 1794, hundreds of American ships are seized by the British because we are seen as allies of France, even though we're not helping in this war. Hamilton is in a panic because he believes an all-out war will mean the end of American foreign trade and the end of his tariff system, which he's relying on to raise taxes. The Secretary of State is Edmund Randolph, and he's a Jeffersonian Republican, which is to say he's pro-French. Hamilton is pro-British, because that's who we do business with, right? So Hamilton will get George Washington to not send the Secretary of State, who's supposed to be our chief diplomat, but to send John Jay, the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, a Federalist and a friend of Hamilton's, to negotiate a treaty with Britain to keep us out of the war. The treaty was complex, and when it came back to America, it was widely hated. It settled the issue of the northwestern border of the United States in favor of America. It established we would remain neutral in the war, and it established our right to trade. So what's bad about it? Why do people get upset? Well, it didn't stop impressment of our sailors. The British were essentially kidnapping American sailors and forcing them into the British Navy. It also didn't get any compensation for our lost ships or cargo that the British were seizing. The treaty was widely opposed in the Senate, although ultimately it was ratified, and the people hated it. In fact, John Jay said famously, after his treaty, he could have traveled from Georgia to Massachusetts, and had the way lit by himself being burnt in effigy. That's where they make a dummy of you and hang you. So that's Jay's Treaty. Jay's Treaty, though, made possible Pinckney's Treaty. Pinckney's Treaty is a treaty with Spain. The diplomat here, of course, is Pinckney. And it's written in 1795, and it says that the United States can use the Mississippi River and New Orleans for trade. It also says that the Florida border will be set at the 31st parallel, which is basically what America wanted. Spain agrees to try to stop Indians raiding out of Florida, and people in America generally loved this treaty. And so it's kind of ironic, these treaties, which were essentially written at the same time, one was incredibly hated, the other was extremely popular. After serving 2 terms, so 8 full years, in 1796, George Washington decides he will not run for a 3rd term. This shocked most people. People assumed Washington would just be president until he died, just winning election every 4 years. But Washington didn't really seem to care for the job very much. He had other things on his mind, namely his estate. He saw his primary duty at that point in his life to take care of his estate at Mount Vernon. But nonetheless, he decides he won't run for a 3rd term. There will also be published in the paper, I should say, a letter called Washington's Farewell Address. Now, Washington didn't really have much to do with this thing. Washington asked Madison to write it originally, but then Hamilton got a hold of it later and significantly rewrote it. And so even though it's under the name of Washington, in reality it's mostly the sentiments of Hamilton with a little Madison mixed in. Now, Washington read it and signed off on it, but it's largely the thoughts of Alexander Hamilton. So now we have an election. The first election where we're not sure who's going to win, because everybody knew Washington was going to win as long as he ran. The Democratic choice for a nominee is obvious, Thomas Jefferson. He had been their intellectual and spiritual leader since they were a party. In fact, they often called themselves Jeffersonians. Now, the flip side of that is Alexander Hamilton. Now, he was the intellectual and spiritual leader of the Federalists, and they sometimes called themselves Hamiltonians. But he was widely disliked as a person. People didn't particularly trust him or like him. And so he had a hard time gaining support to be the actual candidate. Perhaps a more obvious choice was John Adams. He had been the vice president. He was, of course, as key as anyone had been in the Revolutionary War and the intellectual foundation of the country. He and Jefferson are probably the 2 great figures there. But Hamilton hated Adams, and he hated Adams for 2 reasons. One, Adams was difficult to get along with. He was kind of crotchety and set in his ways, and didn't listen to other people very well. But more importantly, and related to that, he didn't listen to Hamilton. Hamilton basically told the Federalists what to do, including Washington, and they usually did it. But Adams didn't really like Hamilton or trust him or care what he had to say. So Hamilton is going to try to get the Federalists to nominate Thomas Pinckney